Breaking news: a political earthquake has just shattered the uneasy calm between London and New Delhi. Moments ago, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi officially blocked the entry of a high-level Labour delegation, sending shockwaves through Westminster. The order came just hours after Keir Starmer accused India of drifting toward authoritarianism. Within minutes, India's foreign ministry struck back. Visas revoked, meetings cancelled, and the diplomatic channels plunged into silence. Inside Downing Street, phones rang like alarms in the night. The Foreign Office went into lockdown. Reporters outside Parliament spoke of chaos, confusion, and raw fury. Starmer, blindsided and humiliated, demanded answers. How dare he shout us out? He was overheard saying his aides pale with panic, but Modi's camp had already made its move. A statement that thundered across global headlines. India will not be lectured by those who still carry the shadow of empire. For decades, Britain's relationship with India had been complicated. Polite smiles masking old wounds. But tonight that fragile facade collapsed. What began as a debate on human rights turned into a full-scale diplomatic storm. Starmer's speech, delivered in Parliament just 48 hours ago, accused India of silencing dissent and weakening democracy. It was meant to sound principled. It ended up sounding imperial. Within hours, India's media erupted. Anchors calling it British arrogance dressed as virtue. Social networks across Asia exploded with anger. By dawn, Modi's cabinet had convened an emergency session. Their decision was swift, decisive, and brutal. The Labour delegation would not be allowed entry. In London, disbelief turned to outrage. Foreign Secretary David Lammy warned the move was unprecedented. Rachel Reeves called it a diplomatic insult of the highest order. Yet behind closed doors, intelligence briefings painted a far darker picture. This was no random retaliation. It was a message India had drawn a red line. The age of British moral superiority was over. And for the first time in modern history, it was London that looked like the junior partner. Television screens flickered with split images, and Starmer's grim face on one side, Modi's calm defiance on the other. Commentators compared it to a geopolitical chess match, where one wrong move could collapse decades of trade and cooperation. Business leaders panicked. The pound dipped in early trading. British companies with billions invested in India began calling for immediate damage control. But there was no damage control because the damage was intentional. Inside Parliament, whispers grew louder. Senior Labour figures privately blamed Starmer for overstepping. Even some of his own MPs questioned why he had chosen this fight. He wanted to look strong abroad. One insider said instead, "He looks powerless at home." The Conservative benches, smelling blood, erupted with laughter during Prime Minister's questions. Rishi Sunak, trying to appear neutral, merely shook his head and warned of serious consequences for Britain's standing. But this wasn't just politics. It was pride to many in India. Starmer's words reopened wounds that had never healed. To many in Britain, Modi's retaliation felt like a humiliation that could not go unanswered. Nationalists on both sides seized the moment. On Indian television, pundits declared this a new independence, a second decolonization in Britain. Commentators called it the end of soft power. The atmosphere was electric, volatile, and one spark away from explosion. Then, just as officials scrambled for diplomacy, a leak appeared online, an internal Labour memo, suggesting Starmer's team had planned to pressure India on trade reforms through moral leverage. The timing was devastating. Indian newspapers splashed it across front pages. Labour's colonial tactics exposed. By sunset, protests had erupted outside the Indian High Commission in London. Supporters waved flags, chanted slogans, and demanded that the government stand up to Modi's arrogance. Yet the mood inside Westminster was far from patriotic. It was panic. Advisors warned that a trade summit scheduled for next week could collapse entirely, and as Britain's media turned on Starmer, one question echoed across every newsroom. Had the Labour leader just triggered the worst UK-India crisis in a generation? If this was just the beginning of Modi's retaliation, what would come next? Would India freeze trade, recall its diplomats, or would Stoner double down and turn a war of words into a political catastrophe? That could define his leadership forever. The next morning, Britain woke to a storm it could no longer contain. What began as a diplomatic dispute was now a full-scale political crisis. Keir Starmer's office released a statement, calling India's decision deeply regrettable and undemocratic. But those words only added fuel to a fire that was already out of control. Within minutes, Indian news networks broadcast Starmer's remarks, alongside old footage of British colonial officers, a brutal juxtaposition that reignited public fury across India. By noon, hashtags like #RespectIndia and #Stoma Insults to democracy were trending worldwide. In New Delhi, Prime Minister Modi addressed the nation in a televised statement that carried the calm menace of a leader who knew exactly what he was doing. India, he said, is no longer a colony to be lectured. Those who speak of democracy should first look in the mirror. The speech hit London like an explosion. His words echoed through every newsroom firm, every embassy, every financial district boardroom. Within hours, British diplomats were summoned home from Delhi for consultations. The Foreign Office called it a temporary step, but insiders whispered a harsher truth. Relations had frozen behind the glass doors of Westminster. The atmosphere was thick with fear and betrayal. Advisors huddled in back rooms, scrambling for ways to contain the fallout. "We can't win this," one senior aide admitted quietly. "Every word we say makes it worse." Newspapers began to turn what had started as a moral crusade was now being framed as a reckless miscalculation. Headlines read Starmer's India gamble backfires. Britain isolated on global stage. Even Labour loyalists on social media began asking if the leader had gone too far. Meanwhile, Modi's government went further still. India suspended ongoing negotiations over a £28 billion trade agreement that had taken 3 years to craft. British exporters went into panic. The pound began to tremble against the rupee. Sus demanded clarity, but there was none. Only silence from New Delhi and defiance from Labour. Starmer's team tried to rally the narrative, insisting that human rights cannot be traded for profits. Yet the tone fell flat in the eyes of the public. He was no longer defending democracy. He was fighting to save face. The situation escalated when an Indian official leaked a confidential cable to a local journalist. The document revealed that several Labour MPs had privately sought meetings with Indian opposition figures to raise concerns about Modi's leadership. The leak was devastating. It confirmed what Modi's supporters had suspected, that Labour wasn't just criticizing India, it was meddling in its politics. Overnight, the Indian parliament roared with outrage. One MP called it foreign interference disguised as virtue. In Britain, the political earthquake deepened. Tory ministers accused Labour of endangering national interests. Nigel Farage went on air calling Starmer a colonial preacher in a suit. Even neutral commentators couldn't deny it. Britain looked arrogant, outdated, and weak. Polls began to shift. A new survey showed public confidence in Starmer's foreign policy, collapsing to its lowest level yet. Through it all, Starmer remained defiant. In a late-night interview, his voice trembled slightly as he insisted, "We must stand for values even when it costs us." But his words carried an undertone of desperation. Viewers could sense it. The story was slipping away from him, and somewhere behind the diplomatic theater. King Charles was said to be quietly concerned. Palace aides hinted that the monarch had reached out to Modi privately, urging calm, warning that this could damage the historic bond between nations. But if the king hoped for restraint, he would be disappointed, because just as Westminster prepared to de-escalate, India struck again. A sudden announcement from Modi's office declared new restrictions on British-funded NOs operating in India, accusing them of spreading political propaganda under humanitarian disguise. Overnight, dozens of British charity offices were raided. Their staff questioned, their accounts frozen. London was stunned. This wasn't a diplomatic spat anymore. It was a message to the world. Modi was proving that India no longer bowed to Britain's moral lectures, and the world was watching. The narrative had flipped completely. Once the empire, now the humbled, as tension reached boiling point. One question began haunting every corridor of power. Had Keir Starmer accidentally awakened a global realignment, where Britain's voice no longer mattered? Would he back down and apologize to calm the storm? Or would pride push him into the one mistake that could destroy his leadership forever? What began as a war of words had turned into a global humiliation. Foreign embassies were now describing it as the London isolation crisis. News anchors in Washington and Brussels called it the day Britain lost its diplomatic mask. In New Delhi, the mood was triumphant. India's media framed it as justice, a historic reversal of power. For centuries, one commentator declared, London dictated terms to India. Now India dictates to London. The applause inside the Indian parliament was deafening. Inside Westminster, however, it was despair. Starmer's face had become the symbol of arrogance gone wrong. Leaks from within his office revealed panic meetings. Stretching into the early morning hours, aides argued about tone, optics, and honor. Some wanted him to issue an apology. Others warned it would make him look weak. "We can't bend to Modi," one aide snapped. "Slamming the table if we apologize. We lose the moral high ground," another voice replied coldly. "We already lost it that night." Britain's streets began to stir. Protesters gathered outside Parliament, carrying both Indian and British flags. Some chanted for peace, others demanded Starmer's resignation. The air was electric, heavy with a sense that something historic was breaking apart. Not just a diplomatic bond, but a nation's sense of authority across the sea. Modi stood unmoved. His government announced it would suspend all scheduled bilateral meetings until mutual respect is restored. Those final words echoed like thunder through London's political elite. Starmer appeared on national television the next morning. His tone was firm, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. "Britain will never apologize for standing for democracy," he said, voice steady but strained. "We will continue to speak truth even when others silence it." Yet the reaction was brutal. Commentators accused him of misreading the moment. "He's fighting ghosts," one said. "India isn't the enemy, his ego is." Then came the economic aftershock. The Confederation of British Industry warned that trade with India could collapse by 40%. Within weeks, airlines began canceling routes. Universities reliant on Indian students issued urgent statements, calling for calm. The ripple spread beyond economics to make it was cultural, emotional, almost spiritual. Britain was realizing that the world it once commanded no longer existed. And through it all, King Charles maintained a heavy silence. But sources whispered that behind palace doors, the monarch was furious, not at Modi, but at his own government's failure to anticipate the storm. The king, who had spent years nurturing Commonwealth ties, saw decades of diplomacy reduced to rubble in days. He feels betrayed by his ministers. One court insider said they've turned pride into poison. By the week's end, Labour's internal cracks became impossible to hide. Angela Rena reportedly confronted Starmer in private, telling him, "You've humiliated us on the world stage." Several senior MPs began floating the unthinkable, an internal challenge to his leadership. The public, too, had turned. Poll numbers plummeted, headlines screamed Starmer versus Modi. The fight Britain lost, yeah. Behind the noise, something deeper was unfolding. Across the nation, people began asking harder questions about Britain's identity, its place in the modern world, and its lingering sense of entitlement. How had a single speech turned allies into adversaries? How had one man's pride undone decades of progress? The conversation had shifted from politics to principle, and in that shift lay a painful truth. The empire's shadow still haunted the island that once ruled half the world. As the final blow came, it was quiet, almost ceremonial. India's ambassador confirmed that all bilateral talks were suspended. Indefinitely, no shouting. No drama, just silence. The sound of a door closing on centuries of history. That night, Keir Starmer stared out over the lights of Westminster. From his office window, the streets below glowed with blue sirens and protest chants. The weight of his misstep hung in the air like smoke. A single question burned in his mind, and in the mind of the entire nation. Had Britain just witnessed the moment it stopped being a world power? Or was this the wake-up call it needed to find its soul again? Share your thoughts in the comment section, and subscribe our channel for more UK news. Thank you.